Welcome to Talking Materials Handling. In each episode, you'll hear from the thought leaders who are shaping what happens inside the four walls of the distribution center. We'll cover the gamut, from automation and robots to software and the next gen technologies that are enabling the workforce of tomorrow. This podcast is hosted by Bob Trebilcock, the executive editor of Modern Materials Handling. Remember that Bob welcomes your comments. Now, to today's episode. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talking Materials Handling. Next Gen Order Fulfillment, what will the DC of tomorrow look like? I'm Bob Trebilcock, and joining me today is Andy Lockhart. Andy is the Director of Strategic Engagement for North American Warehouse Solutions at Vanderlande Industries. Andy, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. Great to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And this is just a topic that's near and dear to my heart, given my role at Modern Materials Handling. It's also one in a series of podcasts I'm recording to highlight content from Next Gen 2023, where Andy was a panelist just talking about this topic. Now, there's little debate that the function of the warehouse has changed over the last decade. Sure, we still receive, put away, pick and pack and ship. But not so long ago, the primary role of the warehouse was storage. Today, it's a fulfillment engine that makes good on a business's go-to-market strategy. So, what will the warehouse of tomorrow look like? That's what we're going to talk about today. So, Andy, let's get started. Now, rather than look right to the future, I want to kick this off with a question about the present. I think it's fair to say that almost every company I talk to these days is in the midst of transforming their distribution centers with new technologies. I think on the panel you were on, we had some, end users who were talking about what they were doing. As a solution provider, you see customers in any number of different verticals, not just retail or not just medical supplies. Whether it's robotics, shuttles, autonomous vehicles, automated packaging, what are the 2 or 3 reasons why your customers are automating? And second part, are they changing as we come out of the pandemic? Now, I realize there's a lot packed in there, and I'll just step out of the way and let you take it.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, there was a fair amount in there, and I think there's an underlying thing that we've all heard many times before, which is the labour question. I think labor was an issue before the pandemic. Labor was an issue during the pandemic. And labor is still an issue. I mean, it's not only can I get the labor, it's if I get the labor, will they turn up tomorrow? So it's that sort of reliability of labor as well as actually finding it. So that's still a fundamental driving factor that you see with across the board. And I think then when you start getting into different verticals like e-commerce in particular, the ability to fulfill your orders accurately is a real driver, and of course automation helps a lot with order accuracy, and I think that's really getting important. And we'll talk about it probably later, but so if you don't do accurate orders, then you get returns which you have to pay for, and the story continues in terms of how much that really starts to cost. So order accuracy is definitely something that's really driving, and I think the other thing that we're starting to see is how do I get more out of my facility that I have? I don't want to go around building lots of new warehouses and all the costs associated with that. So given my existing facilities, how do I get more out of that? And I think that's the other big thing is with automation, I can get more orders per day, units picked out of that same facility or that same square footage as well, because obviously automation allows you to use the cube of the building, not just the floor space. So again, those are other drivers that I can get more for the same, as to say. So those are probably 3 of the big ones. I mean, there's obviously a long laundry list of different companies will have different things, but those pop up on a regular basis. And I think e-com took a boom time through the pandemic, and then took a nosedive after the pandemic when people went back to stores and shopped in stores. So there's that, but now that sort of all normalized back again. So you're seeing sort of the same sort of functions that were happening before the pandemic are happening again now, and the sort of same growth numbers or similar growth numbers. So it's an interesting dynamic, and that, of course, the market dynamics we see today, caused by the economy and everything else that's causing fluctuations in people's spending behaviors and stuff, is also biting into things.
It was interesting that you started off with labor, and I was glad to hear you say, it was a problem before the pandemic. I was writing something this morning and said that, if you talk to any DC manager, and I talked to quite a few of them, they'll tell you that, the labor shortages we were hearing about in the pandemic are back to normal or back to what it was pre-pandemic. That wasn't a great time. DCs were experiencing 100% turnover, in the workforce on an annual basis before the pandemic. So going back to 100% turnover isn't like a big improvement, right? Um,
Not at all.
yeah. Can you give us, even if you can't mention the customer, can you give us an example of a project that kind of illustrates what you were just talking about?
Um, yeah, sure. I mean, it's what you're seeing is they, how do you deal with that labor shortage? As you say, it's 100% turnover, and typically picking, especially in an e-com environment, is the single biggest consumer of labor, and so coming up with solutions that really help with that picking side of things and reduce the labor requirements around picking is probably the lowest hanging fruit for any operator. And then it's a case of how you actually implement that with not just creating an island of automation, but that's typically where we see the biggest single pieces. If I'm especially on an e-com, I mean other things as well, but I have most of my manpower is about how do I pick items, how do I meet the customer promises that my marketing department has made for me, is to say, so I get those out to the customer in a timely fashion. Obviously, over time, Amazon has driven the 2 day, the 1 day, the overnight, and other retailers have had to respond to that. Perhaps other retailers may have started off with, "I'll get it to you in a couple of weeks." Well, that sort of dynamic has certainly changed a lot. So striving to get that has put a real load into that, how they pick and pack out that type of thing. So I think that's where we have seen a lot of customers attack that area first, because that's one of the easier places to hit, and it's obviously the lowest hanging.
Andy, just to pick a little bit at that, we see picking also is the place, because particularly with e-fulfillment, it is so labor intensive. I'm going to use an analogy of voice and then bring it back to picking. When and try to link it to these new technologies. When voice first came out, um, it was primarily a picking technology, right? People used it to get more accurate and be hands free. And that's kind of where it was for many years. As the technology got better and people got more experience with it, they started asking, well, if I'm using voice for picking and I've already made the investment, how can I leverage that investment? How can I get more, out of picking? And they started, doing cycle counting and then using it for put away and retrieval and things like that. With these new automation technologies, I guess particularly things like autonomous mobile robots, they're starting them in picking, but our customers, as they get accustomed to them, then saying, "Well, could I use it for another operation? Could I use it at receiving? Could I use it for replenishment? Could I use it to get things to shipping?" Are we starting to look at ways to broaden out and get more out of that investment?
Yeah, it's interesting, especially when you mentioned AMRs or autonomous mobile robots, and then you get variations on what an AMR is. So I mean, AMR today is, there's multiple types of AMRs out there. There's another breed called ACRs, which is autonomous carton robot, which is again a little bit different, and that has, they're almost like different uses. So I need my sports car for doing the fast stuff, but I need my pickup truck for carrying lots of payload around. So it's these AMRs are starting to get into that sort of uh, different AMRs for different purposes. So back to your analogy, yes, people are, but they're not necessarily the same beast for doing the different tasks. So,
Okay.
which again is a different thing. I mean, we see a lot of that going on in terms of how this AMR development is. And I sort of go back to, I'll give you a little story. When I first started in this industry 11 years ago, I met somebody who said, I don't need all this fancy automation stuff. I just put a million square foot up, put people in there, and I'm done. You know, today that's such a not a reality anymore that you can't do. So you're seeing the technology move faster and faster in terms of what it can do and what it's capable of doing.
One of the terms we hear a lot today is this idea of flexible automation. You know, everybody says, "Oh, I want flexible automation. I don't want it bolted to the floor unless, it's an operation where I know what I'm going to be doing in 5 years or something like that." It's the idea that automation that can more easily adapt to changes in your order profiles or growth. When you think about it at Vanderlande and the things you're doing, what does flexible automation mean to you? And how do you think it's going to impact the design of distribution centers going forward?
That's a great question, and that flexible word is bandied around a lot, and perhaps us vendors are way good at using that word a lot for meaning a lot of different things. And so, to an operator, what does that really mean? And I think for an operator, this is where they really have to understand their business a lot better and their data a lot better. But flexibility can still be, something that's bolted to the ground like a shuttle, because you're fundamentally you're trying to be something that is sort of SKU agnostic and order agnostic in terms of I'm not worried about what you're putting into the system, and I'm not worried about what the orders arrive like. And then it's, how do I expand it? Now, with the sort of AMR and ACR type philosophies, expanding becomes a lot easier because you're just adding more robots. But in the
Right.
same respect with shuttle systems, you can add more shuttles depending on the type of shuttle system you have. So, if you've got level roaming uh, shuttle systems, you can have more shuttles and get more throughput. So that sort of addresses one of those things of growth. Obviously, when you're having to add more storage, that's in a bolted down system is a bigger thing than say an AMR based one where it's a simpler process. But all of them are the same way. Is that how do I get more out of that asset? How do I sweat that asset better? And so one of the aspects obviously is the software, so that you aren't worried about what the today's SKU profile looks like or the order profile looks like, because tomorrow's is going to be different and I can deal with that. That's one piece of flexibility. And the other piece obviously is I need to expand what I put in. And one of those aspects of I need to expand what I put in is also did you leave space in your warehouse to expand it? So it doesn't matter whether it's AMR based or shuttle based or anything else based. If you didn't allow space to add more, or you have to take racks down to add more, then you've got to deal with those sorts of things. So flexibility sounds great, but you've got to really plan ahead in terms of as an operation in terms of where do I put it, how can I expand the footprint of whatever I'm putting in.
When you're implementing, we've got a lot of people who are going from relatively conventional facilities to now trying to bring, high levels of automation. So, what's the biggest challenge you're confronting or your customers are confronting when they go to higher levels of automation, and how are you overcoming it? Is it integrating the systems? We always hear about integration with software. Is it training your people? Is it rethinking processes, maintenance? What are the couple of biggest challenges, and how do you prepare for that?
So I think that's a really double-edged question there, because there's integration, and being an integrator is sort of on the vendor side. Are they able to integrate all these various subsystems together and the software together to give the customer an overall solution? Because in the past people bought islands of automations that didn't talk to each other. Well, that really doesn't it's great for a while, but then it hits an end stop. And so today, people are much more wanting to have that fully integrated solution. So from a vendor perspective, that integration is really important, and that is a challenge to make sure it all does work together and that you don't have any weird interactions happening or bottlenecks. But from the operator's perspective or the customer's perspective, that's a really different type of thing, because from their perspective, it's training, it's understanding how that system works, because they're fairly used to a pretty manual type of system, even it might have some conveyors and sorters. It's a very different thing from doing a highly automated system where the way you run it is a bit different. So you have to you want to sweat the asset, you want to fully utilize it, you want to drive it so it's being used most of the time. Automation doesn't work well if you do a stop-start approach to life. So that is where training comes in, and that's a particularly important piece for the customer to fully understand that. So they really do get the advantage of the automation out and don't run into problems because they're not really running it how it should be run, which again is a mindset change. And then of course, yeah, you have maintenance and stuff, but if you're getting maintenance from your vendor, they know how to do that. But if you're going to take on that maintenance yourself, then you really need to understand the type of people you need. You've got to hire different skill sets. You've got to understand when you can do the maintenance, how you do the maintenance. So in some respects, the challenges for the customer are around understanding how to operate the system they purchased, how to maintain it if that's what they're going to do, as opposed to where on the vendor end it's more about integrating all those different pieces together to provide that single solution for the customer.
So one of the points you just made, I think, is a great one. We think of automation as eliminating jobs, but the reality is, at least today, there's no such thing as a lights out warehouse, right? We're still going to rely on people. So how do you manage differently in an automated warehouse over a conventional warehouse? And are the skills needed to work in an automated warehouse different? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, automation brings less people than typically, ROIs for automation are about. I don't need so many people to run it. So your skill set is going from those mundane jobs to a more interesting job in some respects. Now that can be when you look at lights out warehouse has been a panacea for I don't know how long in this industry, but getting there is a different matter. But
Right.
so a lights out warehouse for the happy path, if you like, yeah, that sounds great. But the happy path does not happen 100% of the time. So you have to have people to be able to deal with when things go wrong, when things need checking. You have all the maintenance pieces to do. There's still functions within a warehouse like returns, for instance. That is nowhere near a lights out operation. Now, perhaps once the AI world has taken over the world, then maybe that's fine. But if you look at a returns process, you get something back in, somebody has to inspect it, somebody has to put it back into the system. All of that, and that's very labor intensive. That still has to happen. So, and when you see like returns volumes at 30%, that's a huge volume of product that potentially can come back into a warehouse. So I think really what it is you're taking away the mundane jobs with the automation, but you're moving them into more productive, financially, make you more money, as to say, type of roles.
Is it a different worker, a different set of skills, or is it more, simplifying the task for the existing worker?
Well, obviously, if you're moving them into a more sort of maintenance operational role, then that's definitely a skill set up. Other
Right, right,
roles are, yes, you're trying to define the role for them in a different way. The type of activity they're doing is not, you know, pick one from here and put it to there. So it's not that such a repetitive piece of work. But you definitely do have to. There's definitely an upskill and more things you have to think about in the role. But yeah, you would definitely make sure that you've created the skill set and the processes to support it, so that you're not you're not wanting somebody with a PhD to do it. So.
All right, so we've been talking about sort of the present state of things. Let's, for a couple of questions here, look at the future. If you think about your customers' roadmaps, where are we going, or what do you think the warehouse of the future is going to look like in 5 or more years from now, from your perspective and what you're seeing at Vanderlande?
Okay, so some of that is a bit of get my crystal ball out, but
Exactly, yes.
things are obviously are moving quickly, and I think you could definitely say that the rate of change of technology is increasing, just like any form of technology, whether it's in a warehouse or whether it's within your house. But I think we've heard all the AI hype, but I think to be serious, that is having a bigger and bigger impact, because that is going to improve the the picking robots, if we start, we're already seeing deployment of robots picking, but they can pick, I don't know, something like 50 to 70% of articles in a warehouse, maybe.
Right.
Certain things they really struggle with. And as you see that sort of AI learning and computer learning coming along and improving, you're going to see that, what can they pick become a much larger chunk. So what they can't pick becomes a very small piece eventually. So maybe goes away completely. I don't know. So you see that sort of thing. There's also algorithms around if you're doing things like palletizing or depalletizing, those sort of stuff getting cleverer and cleverer. So I think all those sorts of things, and I think the other thing you're starting to see is with the trailer unloading and loading type functions as well. Because if you look at it, if somebody's unloading a trailer in Texas in the middle of the summer, it's one of the most unappealing jobs in the world when you're working in 120-degree plus weather. But
Right.
if you look at some of the robots today, yes, they can do it. But when you start to get the boxes that have been damaged or squashed, that's when they start to really struggle. So I think you'll start to see the technology around making all these robotic functions that you see in the warehouse today become more intelligent, capable of dealing with the unhappy path type items as that don't work. That you need somebody to go in and do it themselves today. The robots are going to get more intelligent. So I think you'll start to see that. The other aspect is what AMRs can do and how they integrate. I think is going to change over time as well. So you're starting to see like the ACR, which is like I don't know, it's a mini load, but on an AMR. They're already picking at going up to 12 meters. So and they've grown from 8 meters a year ago to 12 meters now. I know this is all metric, sorry, but so sort of 36 feet, 40 feet, as opposed to 20, 30 feet. So again, you'll start to see that capabilities and what they can do, the traffic management around AMR, so you can get more density, the density of storage around what AMRs can handle. So all those things are all things that you're starting to see that will have an impact on the warehouse.
So, Andy, you mentioned early on in one of our questions about how we've gone from AMRs to this kind of whole different fleet or complement of robots, and I wondered. I'll give you an example. Gap was one of our presenters, and the first time I talked to Gap, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, they had put in their first. They have always had high levels of automation, but it was around like mini load systems and conveyor and sorters, right? And 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, they were one of the first customers of a piece picking put wall. They put in Kindred AI. Today, they're the largest user of Kindred AI. So that was kind of their introduction to robotics. And then the next thing they did was to put in Exotech to handle returns. So it wasn't so much about picking as it was returns processing. And then those things that they processed, they could pick from the Exotech system, when there was orders for it. And then more recently, and I don't know what's happened with it, but they had piloted one of the trailer unloading robots that you're talking about, and had a successful pilot, and we're starting to roll that out. So none of those things were an integrated solution, right? Exotech was a whole different process from what Kindred was doing, from what the other was, but they started with automation in the center of the facility, and now they're looking at other tasks and saying, well, what other robots can I bring in? Is that kind of where we're headed? You sort of hinted at that early on.
So it's funny you bring up Gap. So I have fairly intimate knowledge of Gap because I was very much involved with the original mini loads and shuttles that went into Gap. So it's interesting. So Gap as a company, or Kevin Kuntz and his supply chain team, are probably much more advanced than most people are, and so they've got them. I can get this piece of technology to solve this particular problem. So it is sort of bits and pieces all around the place. Whereas other companies that don't necessarily have that level of expertise in their organization look for a complete solution. So they're going to buy everything in from one person that does everything. Then they're not going to work out how to put your erector set together, as to say. So I think Gap is a bit different in that sense, but I think you're right. I mean, when Gap put in their first mini load, like I think it was like 12 years ago or something. So
Yes.
it wasn't the technology that you talked about, like Kindred and Exotech and all these other things, just didn't exist when they started their journey. Whereas somebody today coming in, you've got a lot more choice of stuff already. So you can start at a much higher level with a much more integrated approach. And I think for a lot of companies, that more integrated approach is the sort of favored solution because they don't necessarily have the expertise to patchwork stuff together.
Two more questions. We hit on the lights out warehouse, and there are like I've written a lot about grocery distribution, and there are facilities out there in the grocery industry that come close. They're not completely lights out, but where basically lift truck on receiving, lift truck on shipping. Once a pallet's inducted into the system, like it's all automation until it exits the other side as a store ready pallet. Um, is lights out going to be possible, or are we more likely to see some lights out around processes?
I honestly think well, I mean, you talked about that sort of that grocery thing, and you get some things where you can get pretty close to lights out, but I think on a whole, you're going to have processes that can be pretty lights out, but there's going to be processes like I talked about earlier about returns. I mean, you can't lights out returns, so um, that's going to stay where it is until there's some much more sophisticated pattern recognition AI robotic type thing. But so I think to be serious though, there's certainly processes that can be lights out, but there are other processes that are not going to be. You still need that sort of maintenance and you know function in there to make sure everything is working right. Because your lights out is great until something goes wrong. Then what do you do? And so you still need that sort of thing of people there to make sure if something goes wrong, it gets fixed. But I still think there's processes that are going to take a long time before they become truly lights out. So it's going to be a mixture. I mean, some depending on what your product is and what your warehouse is doing, it's going to be easier to get closer to that lights out thing. But I think things like ecom is a harder one to go lights out than perhaps what you talked about there with grocery, where you're just moving pallets in and out. As soon as you get into mixed palletizing, becomes harder. The more complex your fulfillment process is, the harder it is to get to lights out. I guess is what I'm saying.
Last question. And you mentioned AI earlier, and that might actually be the answer. But regardless of whatever you're offering today, what's the technology that you're watching or that intrigues you the most that you think is going to have the most impact on the warehouse of the future?
Well, I mean, yeah, AI, and I think pattern recognition, which sort of is a sort of subset of AI, I guess. I think how that influences the development, because I think this industry as a whole has it started off its development as pieces of hardware, pieces of rotating machinery. Is fundamentally what it's based on, and then software came along, and today none of these warehouse systems operate without software. So software is the key, actually the key driver. I mean, somebody once described to me that all these material handling systems are all boat anchors without software, and I think that was true a few years ago, and is getting software is the fundamental driver, and that's where AI sits in that software stack. It's not something separate. So all of this technology, even when you get to robot picking, you can get fancy indifactors that can pick different things, but without the software that drives it, then nothing. So I think sophistication around software is going to be a real key driver for a lot of things around that. And of course, AI being brings on that machine learning and capability to do more with what you've got in terms of functionality.
So it's not the hardware; it's the intel inside, so to speak.
It's the intelligence. Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at lots of things. I mean, whether you look at AutoStore or shuttles or AMRs, Exotech, you name them, they all are dependent on that intelligence that the software brings.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andy. That's all the time we have today. A special thanks to my guest, Andy Lockhart from Vanderlande. And thank you for joining. I hope you'll be back for our next episode. And finally, be sure to go to nextgensupplychainconference.com. That's kind of a mouthful. And enter your email address for updates about NextGen 2024. We do have a date, October 21 to 23, back at the Chicago Athletic Association Hotel. We're planning another great event. So for Talking Materials Handling and the NextGen Conference, I'm Bob Trebilcock, and Andy, thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Talking Materials Handling is produced by Modern Materials Handling and Peerless Media. You can find Talking Materials Handling on mmh.com, on iTunes under SC247, or just Google SC247 Podcasts. We're on all the popular podcast platforms. For more information, be sure to visit mmh.com, and we hope you'll join us again for our next episode.